Today is the first lecture, and the theme for today's lecture is a shelter. And for first lecturer, we have a great privilege to have our department head, Wei Jin Wang. Professor Wang has been teaching at Hong Kong U for many years. I would probably think more than 20 years or so. Yeah. And he cares, deeply about your education as well. So the framework of the whole course, Professor Wang had a huge impact and influence in terms of setting this thing up as well. As a fellow educator and an architect, I value his experience, and I always listen what he has to say. Because the experience in architecture is very difficult, not a difficult, but experience in architecture is something that only comes with the time. And if you have somebody with experience, it's a great asset. It's like having a library that's next to you, that you have a great access. So, on that note, maybe perhaps we could start the lecture.
I probably have seen some of you in the Bachelor of Architecture degree kind of briefing, right? And then also perhaps some of you were in the seminar that Mr. Yang Ho Chen and I were doing 2 days ago. The course, as Jay has said, is called, the official name of the course, and that's the name of the course in the last 2 years, is called Visual Cultural. And part of the faculty foundation courses that shared by different departments. And we are in the process of reshaping the faculty foundation courses, and we are here using this opportunity to revise the course in a way. We like the course to be visual cultural but common. It's mostly about an introduction to architecture, and not only architecture and the built environment. So it's about architecture itself, it's also about how architecture related to other disciplines. Therefore, students in the landscape division, students in the conservation program, students in the urban planning, and in the surveyor will be able to participate, take part in your shaping of how architecture plays a role in the physical environment. So that's essentially the course. There are several lectures we will have image later, but I like to start with the notion of today's topics, shelter. Something shelter you and other people, human beings, the living condition, and how it related to the built environment, how it gradually evolved into the concept of dwelling and the concept of architecture. Let's try to imagine at the very, very beginning, your ancestor, you and like you or like me, standing primitive man. Can you see the line? I'll draw it one more time. Yeah. All right. The human being standing on the ground, on the earth, like Heidegger, a philosopher, German philosopher, 19th century or 18th century. talked about the concept of dwelling, of being. He was there, look around the world, and realize and senses, or it's Adam and Eve, senses the atmosphere, the wind, the sun, and he started to find ways of understanding himself, and then he found necessity of something between him and the nature. For example, he realized there are sun, rise from the east, sets on the west, every day, a routine, a rhythm. And he, one day, it rains. So he got wet, yeah, and he realized there's something that the moisture changed, the condition changed, and he become vulnerable. He realized there are wind coming from particular orientation, direction, perhaps summer breeze coming from south, if you live in the northern hemisphere, and winter cold winds coming from the north. So these are environmental conditions. And he lived there, he looked around, and he found trees, forest around him. Yeah? And then he developed an idea, he started gradually develop the idea of learned from experiences of taking the tree trunk and start to build shelter above it. And that is the beginning of a shelter and the beginning of architecture. In that shelter, he realized material that is available, say, from the mountain, that he can find either rocks or pebbles. He piled it up and provide much stronger strength, rigidity for the wall. And the wall not only help, in addition to the timber, erect the columns, the beam, yeah? And then all set of things, and thatch roof, but also be able to provide certain thermal insulation that protect him from the winter winds. If he lives in a particular environment like Hong Kong, then he realized that the amount of roof eave extending from the structure matters, because if in the summertime, if the sun comes in that direction, the roof eaves help him to protect the building envelope from the western sun in the summertime, for example. So his houses become cooler. And he also learned that if he are able to further extend this with some additional structures, he would able to have a place that in the summertime, he and his children, probably his son and wife, would be able to stay very comfortably between the house and the wild, the nature. That is a space as a porch developed gradually into. Then the story can go on and on about if this is in the north, in the snowing country, they learn how to build their roof in a different angle, so the snow can melt, yeah, and the structure can stand much stronger. Okay. So these begin the ideas of a shelter about a human being on the ground, look around using resources, and they start to realize other things, such as they could possibly nearby there's a river, or a lake, or an ocean, where the winds go through that, bring moistures into the house and cool down the temperature. Could be a situation that he learned. Of course, and the mountains on the north, for example, block the wind, and he starts to select the location of his shelter. The mountain block the wind in the wintertime, provide him even a better shelter. Then it's not only him, his brother and sister all built their shelters one next to the other, and clustered together, become a setting, a village, yeah, or even a town. They learn also, like any society, that various ways to develop the system of their mode of production. If a lake has plenty of fish, they learn how to sell. They learn how to fishing, become a fishing community or fishing settlement. Or in many places, you have plenty water supply, and then you learn how to develop the agricultural society with paddy fields, with irrigation system, and it's not only a singular house, it becomes a society. So that is the basic idea there as a shelter, and that's the very, very beginning of architecture, of the daily life necessity rhythm, but also learn the way that how we build something in between us and the natural world. Of course, this is one location, and there are many, many locations, geographical locations in the world that people built shelters. And they took the shape roughly like that, or in other places, say, a different production conditions or normans. They move around with their cattle. They find a technique to build tent using fabric, for example. Yeah? So they can take the fabric apart and ship it with them and build another one, like Mongols, like many, many places. They build tent, and that is another form of shelter to cater for their needs. That could develop into, with the development of civilization, and that shelter can develop into particular ways of learning using mud, built from the areas in perhaps Egypt or nearby Middle East. You learn that through agriculture, you learn from the fertile lands, you will be able to use the soil, making muds and making brick and making wall. And then you learn how to make arch. Then you can have a span, structured span without particular timbers, members. Yeah? And then you start to interpret it the way you build, yeah? With the whole, not only your house, but also other people's house, building in some way. Then it becomes a city. And a city has an idea of a particular way of building things. A city or a particular culture has an idea of how they collectively interpret the universe through a cosmos, through their built environments. We can quote many, many different examples of that, such as another group of society or people learned a good way to build their houses or their shelters in a particular way, say in an urban setting. Yeah? That the house always want to enclose a patio that's surrounded by their house, and that become protected safety and new environmental condition of living, of dwelling. And that in this particular culture, Chinese build that way as well, and that is what we know as a courtyard house. Therefore, you have houses in different climatic region, in different develop into different cultural or ways of building architecture, and that is we know from the idea, singular idea of a shelter, from to protect yourself and to create a mediator between you and the natural environment, into various architecture with the concept and the idea wanted to interpret their social organization, the way they look at the universe, or shall we say, the culture of architecture. So that's the beginning of architecture. With that note, with that note, I'd like to start the lecture talking about, with various examples, traditional, vernacular, as well as contemporary architecture, how the idea of shelter developed, intertwined into the idea of the shelter into the modern ideas, of relatively modern ideas of architecture, and at the end, how they related to the built environment in large. Oh, it's that kind of two projectors. I hate that. Every time I see the two projectors, I don't know which one to look at. Can you turn the light? All right. The course I have said is called Architecture and the Built Environment, and we say the first lecture today is about the shelter, the beginning of architecture. And the course name officially is Visual Culture, as I said, and I deliberately make the visual culture smaller because I think we want to really talking about visuality is certainly part of it, but our primary concern is beyond visuality. It's about architecture as an artifact, architecture situated in the environment, and architecture facilitate social and human conditions. The lecture will be primarily, we designed the lecture together with several teachers, and it's primarily include 4 sessions, shall we say. The first 3 lectures with myself, Jay Lin, and Thomas Dunn, talking about roughly say the meaning, the cultural, the beginning. It's all about still the idea, the construct of the idea of architecture and how we perceive architecture. The second session that we like to talk about is histories. Traditionally, very soon for architecture students, you will take architecture history courses ranging from most of the places in the world teaching the development of Western architecture or European architecture, in particular like this part of the world. Then we also talk about the development of architecture in Asian context or China in a particular case over here. And we also talk about a very important era, which is modern architecture at the early 20th century, the concept of modern architecture and how it leads to the contemporary development of architecture. And then the third sessions that we also intend to have 3 lectures, but actually we are only able to, we still have the 3, but then we take out 1. So the third session we want to say, what we want to say is, with the development, with understanding of architecture, the basic notion of architecture from shelter to an architecture ideas, we want to, we understand, we go through the development, historical development, and we want to look at also architecture, how it related to society, how it related to technology, how it related to ecology, actually many others, economy and many other things. So architecture in the context of many various issues. And at the very end, we want to talk about architecture as a discipline of study, how it related to city, and how architecture is an integral part of the landscape, and more importantly, is part of the environment, and that all human beings are facing together to make a better environment for our future. When talk about shelters, I started thinking in the last few days of how are we able to develop the idea? I'd like to talk about the shelter, which the diagram that I drew with you into a little bit discussion of the idea of dwelling. Houses develop in different part of the world. And they are part of the landscape, geography. We had just briefly talked about. They are part of the geography, and we call that also cultural landscape. A landscape, not purely a landform, but they have been developed through a particular culture, and the landscape become a cultural landscape or cultural geography. And with that understanding, we'd like to talk about the concept of dwelling that is built from all that. And the concept of dwelling, I would go back and quote maybe Heidegger write about or perceive the concept of from shelter to dwelling to architecture. And then I like to talk about the notion of architecture is a shelter, but it developed into a particular ideas that is a place, that a place has meaning, that convey meaning and going through our history. Okay, that's eventually what I tried there to talk about. If we look at examples of dwellings all over the world, in this case, in Greek, a Greek houses built, can't remember the date, long ago, over 1,000 years ago, using local masonry, stone. And in a medieval environment, climatic condition, they have a chimney, but also the houses are using, developed the roof from the tile, and then become a way that at that particular time, people built their vernacular houses in Greek, and maybe later also in Rome and so on, like that. Not far away in North Africa, we found people there are many different ways, but for this one in Syria, for example, people use their earth, built their shelters in that in other places can call adobe, but using red earth to build a way that they found in the places that you don't perhaps have a lot of timbers, then you could easily using the material you have to build the houses. And it's not only the convenience of the material, but it's also the climatic condition that in a desert or Syria that it gets very, very hot in the summertime, in the daytime. Yeah? And so the thick soil provides thermal insulation to shelter the rooms in space inside that cool. And at night it becomes -0, perhaps very cold in the winter time, and that provides thermal insulation in different way. And we go to the other sides of the globe that we found also people built very different. In this case, it's a Thai house. In Southeast Asia, that you have very different climatic condition. It is hot, it is humid. Houses are there, lifted above the ground, and then you build a platform, and then plenty forest around, easily to get timber. You build a house in that way, and it's an agricultural society. You have paddy fields, you have thatch roof that was there for waterproofing. Yeah. And that house are lifted above the ground for why is house not on the ground? But lifted above the ground for better ventilation, right? Because it's humid, and also for safety probably, because in places like that, not only you have mosquito active around 2 meters away, and also you have snakes, you have all sort of insects, yeah? And to be able to build in such a way provides you a high degree of comfort, and then you can start to have raise your chickens and so on under that, and when people go back home, you have to go through the stairs. And then they developed a platform or podium in a way that, as like our earlier drawings, it provide shaded areas of or intermediate spaces between indoor and outdoor, the porch spaces that become the most comfortable space. And then when you get up there, arriving their home, in many cases, they put a bucket of water for you to wash before you go in here. The whole thing become ritual. And the very another examples of that, then we go back to later. We'll use plenty examples to talk about the houses that around this culture, that a courtyard house, a particular way, also a particular way to build. In addition to shelter you with local material available, this has developed into a much higher degree of complication, sophistication in terms of interpret the family relationship, the way they look at the universe, and how one building related to the other building in a city context. In this case, is Beijing. I know some of you, I recognize some of you taking the classes of University Common Core course. So I'm using the same example for that, excuse me, but there will be other things, yeah? So bear with me for some of that, because the fundamental ideas, beginning of architecture remain the same. Now, so with that, we can go on and on, and we find very different ways of we build shelters. Stilt house in Laos, very similar to the Thai house. It lived above the ground, and actually across Pacific Ocean, the Polynesian culture pretty much developed their dwellings in that. And there are particular way that the culture interpret the construction, such as the way the roof ridge is developed, and that you found very similar to in Japan. Some of the vernacular farmhouses that has similar articulation of roof ridge, yeah. And also we certainly believe Japan, part of the Japan origin is coming from the Polynesian islands hopping up. Right? So the way people built, not only coming from available material and technology, but also from the idea, the prototype, and the communication of the prototype. People migrate. They bring along the way they built to a new places, and that influence the people, the way people built in that new places. And the other is the opposite. Of course, the igloo that people use ice in extreme cold condition to build their shelters. So a span, in this case also Mediterranean environment, a stone house, compared to the other one. Now we'll get to this later. That is a modern house. A modern house built by one of the modern architects called Philip Johnson, but ideas of a glass house come from another architect, Ms. van der Rohe, which we'll look at some of the example. But okay. So then the concept of dwelling, the existence of human being in this house is very different from the concept of dwelling of the stone house in Greek, in Spain. They both are shelters. They both have concept, but the concept of how, with new technology of steel and glass, that the new modern man liberate himself and want to create a brand new relationship with the environment, the views and the natural wood in the suburban American context, create the Philip Johnson's glass house. Or if we look at around us, some of you know these houses. That is Santongbo in Chunwan, right? That is Hakka people's house when they moved from North Guangdong gradually to the Pearl River Delta, and in order to protect themselves from the earlier migrants from Guangdong areas, they stay together with a very strong kingship system, and the house in a way protect himself from other earlier arrivals. While the other more extreme example is in Kaiping, that is south of Guangdong, 3 hours away Guangzhou, that immigrants going to other places, Southeast Asia, working and trading and bring back money to build Western influenced village villa. Yeah? And at the same time, because the government has less control over the safety around the areas, pirates were plenty around. Villagers decide to build their house in this way, almost like a castle. So protection and safety become the most important things, and the projection, be able to see far away of all the potential dangers that may endanger the village. So very different way of building in actually not too far away in a geographical region. Now it gets to the first notions that we want to talk about is shelter or dwelling over the world, influenced by, of course, climate and geography. And it is also to do with the geography, the climate, provide opportunity for material and the technology developed from that material. And most important, we need to explain why houses over here in the same places still different from one from the other. Then that is also because climate, material and technology develop into a particular social and cultural and aesthetic preference of the way we built. So houses, vernacular houses always have a prototype, a particular way we built, and that developed into a house form. But the house form was never constant. It was relatively constant, of course, compared to our contemporary society, but the prototype always going through modification, because the new climatic condition, the new material technology developed, and new social condition developed into a new prototype, and they constantly, gradually evolve. In the traditional society, because the environmental changes and the value changes are relatively stable, therefore the house form remain constant for a lengthy period of time. But they do change, like the examples of the Taiping house we were talking about. Right? But in other places, all contemporary society, the condition changed drastically, and we changed. The house form changed much faster than they were. Again, some of them have seen the slides before, bear with me. I'm using the examples of China or Han culture to talk about second ideas. The first idea is house form and culture. This is the book by Amos Rapoport, 1960 something. Probably the most important still now. Explain house form and the diagram or conclusion that he made. Then the second ideas I like to talk about is this whole notion of cultural geography and cultural landscape. In northern China, that we know very much of different geographical condition and the river running through that from west to east, Yellow River. The Yellow River bring earth, dirt from the Mongols desert all the way to the China Eastern Sea. Yeah? It provides fertile agricultural lands all the way along with the soil. And the relatively young sediment soil create villages around, settlements around this. This we are talking about a Neolithic period of time. The earliest, used to be the earliest, I'm not sure if it's still the earliest shelter or dwelling that we found in history. If I'm not too wrong, before 5,000 to 10,000 years, okay, 7,000 years Oh, no, we are 2,000, so 8,000, nearly 10,000 years of a time, yeah? It's timeless. The dwelling take in the form. There are several features that we could see that the dwelling is, it takes in the form of roughly rectangular and is dig down to the ground for about 1 meter or so. Okay? In the yellow earth soil condition, it's not too difficult to dig down because the soil are relatively soft and the water tables are low, so it is dry. And therefore, it makes it much easier, simpler to be able to use timber available around to build a roof, shelter like that. In this case, not even a wall. The stick or tree trunks was directly sit on the ground and leaning toward the center ridge. So of course you need some centerpiece and you have a ridge, but the whole house it's a roof shape, yeah, and that's much easier. So that is earlier first steps, obviously, and later, of course, you learn to erect the column vertical. But the challenge will be you need to find a new element to go horizontally, right? And that is the challenge. And then still remain that slope in a way you can drain water. Yeah? So, and in the house, so these are technology. These are climatic conditions, but in the house you also find some of the sort of pits there, like that. It's places to 做咩？呢度做咩？Cooking, right? You need places to cook, and you need places to cook. You need a place to set fire, yeah. And fire in the house also developed into idea, something sacred. Yeah? A fireplace for cooking, also in the winter time as a fireplace that people sit around, gather around. Yeah? And it becomes the heart of the house. So in many cultures, the fireplace become the core of the house conceptually. Even nowadays, if you go to Lijiang, you look at the Naxi people's houses. There's a fire, all tradition there's a fire, and then you can find numerous examples. Even in the example of contemporary American suburban house, every house has to have a fireplace. Right? The fireplace provides you heat, warm in the winter, but the fireplace also become the places that in the winter time, family get together. Yeah? Reading your newspaper, playing your piano, yeah. Or and conceptually, and so a British gentleman's house has to have a fireplace, yeah, and a rock chair, right, and a decent piano over there. So when the guests come for dinner, after dinner, the daughter has to play piano, and the gentleman sit there smoking cigar. That becomes a ritual, right? So that becomes also the concept of a house. And that fireplace developed even into California, which Southern California, that Los Angeles suburban house, you probably don't need fireplaces in the winter time, but people still build fireplaces because that become a concept of the center of the house. And then in that areas, the way people built. Even nowadays, if you go to the provinces of Shanxi, you still be able to find houses like that. Mostly built about 50 or more than 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, is what known as the cave dwelling, the non-cave dwelling. Yeah? They take in the form of a rectangular shape, like a courtyard house, but the relatively poor farmer there unable to build a house like their neighbor, because you will need timbers. Therefore, they found an easy way to build is you dig down 3 meters below, 4 meters below ground, and you carve into the soil, create chambers, and you still remain the house of courtyard. yeah, a concept of koya. But you live there, rely on the natural material, and with minimum, the most economical conditions, and that is also one ways of the shelter, and that come from related to the very early tradition, probably developed in that. In a very, very different climatic conditions such as here, or Peruvian Delta or Yangtze River, you have plenty of water. Water is a major source of transportation, and waters also create irrigation system and create one of the largest agricultural agricultural landscape in the world, and we call Jiangnan or Peruvian Delta. And this very much water-based and petty field-based societies, if you look at back, and archaeological finding in this case near Zhejiang, the Liangzhu culture, that people in the times already built buildings with sticks, platforms above the ground for the reasons like Thai house and Lao house that we talked about. And even nowadays, houses in many places built platform above the ground for the same reason, because of the geography or cultural landscape. And therefore, a simplified diagram for this particular region, actually various regions. Some places build houses in this way in ancient times, some build houses in that way in ancient times. And then after years of development, many of house developed into a way that their shelter has a platform, a plinth, a way above the ground, and then they have their wall, their roof developed in a tripod condition. Okay. And now you look at the Beijing courtyard house. There's a plinth, a platform, and then you have the wall and column of the main body of the house, and you have a roof that is, after years of development, a very sophisticated, high-style vernacular houses compared to the many other one that for aristocrats, Beijing aristocrats during a particular period of time of their courtyard house. And the fine development of the material language and also sort of a relationship. Could be another term that you could talk about. Let's talk about technology and tectonic. It's about technology, but it's also about the relationship between the logic between architecture elements, and they built up into a relationship that is not only technology but aesthetic. So we describe this as a tectonic relationship. The technology that with a logic, certain logic on that. And houses like that, and another one clustered together into the non-courtyard houses, in this case, in the Beijing Imperial City, that it is a household. It interprets a household itself that provide a particular private outdoor spaces for this house, these units. And then the other one do the same as a shared value of the concept of house, just like the diagram that we drew earlier over there. And that ways of building in Beijing in the north, but also far south, in this case, small islands called Jinmen, between and outskirts of Xiamen, that farmers over there developed through time using different tile. In Fujian, it's a red tile, and then red bricks, and then because of the new development of technology, that they have waterproofing material in the early 20th century, they be able to have a roof deck on top. Therefore, the main house built taller in order to have a window access or small door access that the farmers would be able to, or the fishermen would be able to store their agricultural product or fishing product over there and easily bring out to the deck to get dry in the sunny days. Yeah. And materials, decoration materials for a particular culture also influenced in the early 20th century by traders, bringing back new ceramic tile material. So the traditional craft are turning into relatively contemporary craft at a time, using ceramic tile to represent the ideas of traditional value. That is in the case of Jimen. I had a 2 years military service in this island, and I have nothing to do but go out every weekend to do the survey, measure drawing. That's how I start to learn architecture as a geologist major students. And so I spent hours and hours in this type of courtyard houses, looking around, taking photographs, and I realized that houses like that, 4 meter by 4 meter or 5 meter by 5 meter in dimension. Yeah, it's the places for this courtyard house that the family have their lunch there. The grandfather at night seated on the couch with the young grandson on the stool, looking up at the 4 meter by 4 meter of the sky. Yeah, in the daytime, it's a blue sky. It's the place that you, the dwellers, communicate with the nature. You see the cloud going through, the rains coming down, yeah, and the star and the moon, your nature. So it goes beyond shelter now. It provides you safety, security, privacy, but it also provides, look at the sun and the shade. Most of the time in the southern China, shade is desirable, and in the summertime, it give half of this space, 4 by 4 space, nice cool shade. In the summertime, in the winter time, it still give you quite a good, reasonable, or warm sun into that. Okay, so it moderate climate. But most important is the way the concept of that house becomes a concept of architecture. Yeah, that there is a being there. So now, for all the practicality, you stood there days and nights. I'm sure the grandfather and the kids built up a certain degree of communication about issues of philosophy like Heidegger trying to talk about, yeah, the existence of their human being, yeah, and the sharing of the value of this house. Houses are also full of other things, such as a typical that in this particular culture, Han Chinese, put very refined motifs over that, representing values of the house, scholarly study, honoring the honor of certain family members and achievements. So we always say a Chinese house or a Chinese village is a didactic narratives. It's not just a space and a shelter. It's more than that, because once through generations, people putting all this there, the storyline of the grandfather want to tell the grandsons generation after generation of certain ethic values. We call that a didactic narratives. The space is a narration. The space is telling story. Yeah. The space, the village is telling you story. So the house developed into the dwelling, developed into the ideas that carry meanings. A good example of that is the house in Huizhou, Anhui province, and there's a particular type of building called Huizhou dwelling. That in the courtyard, there is one of the typical motifs, much simpler. We all used to see all the motifs talking about weddings and luck and long lives and all that. And this one is a tree leaves, yeah? And the tree leaf, the shape of the tree leaves, yeah? Yes, yeah, I know it's a leaf. The leaf falling down in the probably autumn time, yeah? So what did it try to say? Try to say, the falling leaves going to the ground, yeah? And it go back to the nature, the soil. the root, going back, the tree leaves going back to where they come from originally, where they belong to, the roots. So what that means, Huizhou merchant, known since Ming Dynasty, 16th, 17th century, go travel to other part of the nation doing business, known as traders. A typical Huizhou boy at the age of 12, he would be sent to Shanghai because his uncle is having a business in Shanghai. So he joined his uncle learning business. He grew up until maybe the age of 16. In the Chinese, he will come back and he found his mother already set up a date for him. So he married that neighbor ladies in the age of 16, and then he still has to go back to Shanghai to continue his career. So until at the age of 60-something, he come back, retire, back to his home, build a new house. So generation after generation, the space or the didactic narratives want to tell their offsprings that returning home to maintain the root in that traditional society. So that is that necessity. There's also the necessity of such. Now, the notion of the courtyard, I'm using this example because it's the most convenient and it's easier for you to understand that the idea of the courtyard, the way we interpret the cosmos, the way it provides safety, security, moderating climatic conditions, have the same prototype that we were talking about, but they varies. In northern China, the courtyard, like the one in Beijing, is much, much bigger in dimension. 10, 15, 20 meters for aristocrat's house. Because the summer sun is very desirable to warm up the houses. Yeah? What we colored here, black for shade, is what we call figure. That's an architecture ways of presenting the idea. What we did not color and leave it white is what we call ground. So we call this type of drawing figure and ground. We try to use to interpret, talking about an idea, very fundamental about space, describing space. Solid and void, that's very typical things that very, very soon your design teacher will be always talking about that. And in the southern China, like in Guangzhou, some of the rich people's houses in this called Xiguan Dawu. In a way, Guangzhou urban mentioned that they also courtyard house, but if you look very, very careful, only very, very small portion of those are white. In other words, open to the skies. Yeah, and most of them are the gray area, which is covered but opened, because in the climate of South China, it's very, very desirable to have such kind of intermediate space. Now, this is pretty much the concept of shelter developed into the idea of architecture shared by society, particular society. If you look at text, that there are various numerous words here, character, describing spatial related meanings, right? Whether it's a room, or a palace, or a pavilion, or a warehouse. Yeah? They're all using the same shape, which is a roof or a shelter. Right? And that, I think, is for this particular culture, the notion of shelter developed into various types of spaces, rooms, and functions and elements related to shelter or architecture. And of course, different cultures will have a similar development. Therefore, the concept of dwelling, the concept of space become further and further elaborated into a complex matrix of meanings. And this is about shelter. Let me just spend a little bit of time to go beyond the shelter of we human beings. Yeah? The idea of the shelter also go to the almighties that every different culture want to glory. Japanese aristocrats in around 12th century in Kyoto, a major powerful family, politically powerful family. When he retired, he had a dream. It was a very Buddhism was very important, played a role in Japan at the time through the introduction of Chinese monk influences. So this Aristotle had a dream about he's getting old, and he looked back at all his life, and he feel glory, he feel sad, he feel regret, and he started to think about his after death. So he had a dream that the Buddha want him to build a temple or a house for the land of Western, Pure Land, the sect of Pure Land. Yeah? And so he had a dream that the day comes and he is receiving by the Buddha into the Pure Land in the West. So he took this, he built this building, takes him 10, 20 years of a time, completed with idea actually provide a shelter for the Buddha. The building is very known as try to represent ideas of the ideal diagram of the Pure Land, which come from the mural in Dunhuang in China and many other places, that Buddha, when you get it, you are there with the Buddha, sitting on the lotus, on top of the lotus and the lotus pond. And every lotus is a little Buddha, and that is you and me, there in that heavenly world. So that ideal image made him, this gentleman, build a temple like that to house the Buddha in the rooms that looking at the lily ponds and with the universe above him. A particular technology developed through China, Korea, and Japan of a timber structure with a particular motif developed to interpret the universe of, at the time, a Buddhist universe of square, of circle, of the angels, the flying angels, Fei Tian, taking him into the paradise lands. The shelter for the Buddha in the Japan, 12th century, in that building, particular building. Remember, the next time you go to Japan, you go to Kyoto, don't just go to Tokyo. Yeah? That building is called Byodo Inn, Phoenix Hall from Hong Kong. It's known for two golden phoenix, one of the very fine, beautiful buildings in the city of Kyoto. Okay, the diagram that we were talking about, the ceiling, the universe, of course, come from many origins, such as the diagram of mandala, that describing the concept of the sacred land, the mountain as the Buddha, and the four Buddha and the four different directions of four mountains. Yeah, and also the idea of circumambulation, of moving around that. It's the square, it's the circle, that is to interpret the infinity, the ultimate sacredness. In the pilgrimage in India, the Sanchi, which is the earliest form of temple in India, was developed in the shape of this semicircle vault. And so people come here and they walk around circumambulance around ascending, and where the relic of the Buddha are supposedly put under that mount. And the ideas of that sacred space developed into later, through many generations, in this case, a Hindu temple, that the mountain, also the ideas of the mandala, further elaborated into the final chamber and the ante-room or the foreroom and the porch, and then into an actual condition. It still has four corners and the center, but it elongated into an actual condition to create the monumentality, enhance the sequence of transition into the final heart of the Hindu deities at the time. Or the same idea of mandala developed, built in a very different, faraway places. In this case, in Java, okay, near Yogyakarta, it's the Java Islands. It's called Borobudur. The Borobudur is built with similar idea of the Sanchi, that on the square and the circle, combination of the square and circle of a series of platforms that the pilgrimage come, circle, ambulance around, ascending, and with the didactic narratives of the story of the sutra, all the way up to the very top, that they have thousands of Buddha sitting there, everyone facing the infinity of the mountain, and this is the ultimate dwelling of the God. All right, that is one aspect, development of that. Now let's look at some other examples. Go back to the idea of shelter. This is a shelter, very clearly. It's in Africa, in South Africa. It was my summer trip a month ago. That in the village in South Africa, close to Mozambique, where every farmhouses has several of these shelters or houses like that. And this one, purely utilitarian use. It's for storage. It's for workshop. And right next to that, the same family has another houses. That is a house for one of the family members. Unlike the Chinese live all around the courtyards, they have a relatively larger piece of land for every family that every adult built their own shelters in such. Of course, using locally available materials of sticks, of muds, and there are very different ways of doing it. And of course, their pet, which is a sheep, guarded the entrance. But next to that house, and every family but next to that, right next to that house, 5 meters away, there's another house. Always every household has houses like that, a round-shaped house, yeah, with a thatch roof and with adobe and the timber as well to construct that shelter. In this case, this shelter is sacred. Is the medicine woman living room over there. So when we visit, we went into the room and she performed rituals and everything for us. It's not places for sleeping. It's the places for their gathering over here, right? So similarly, in a different way, the different form of the houses take different functions, carry out different meanings, and these very relatively basic ideas of dwellings also belong with has a community. So every household scattering around their valley. In the Sunday morning where I went, they all go to church, which is a very small church, of course influenced by the colonial British, earlier Dutch and later British. It's a very, very small chapel, but every villagers were there, except the medicine woman, probably for ideological reasons she wasn't there. So went to that very small shelters, and then on back of the shelters, it built with these timbers. In these rooms, children, adults, spending 3-4 hours there, singing and then reading Bibles and so on. And that is definitely a shelter, but also a community and also a relationship between people, between generations, between various families members. So with that, you have plenty knowledge of dwelling, cultural landscape, the concept of dwelling, and then as the last few examples we were there talking about, it goes beyond a shelter for functional or technological implication, but it creates a locus. It is a location, a locus. It is, some people would say, a place, a particular place that has a meaning. different philosophers, theorists, architects want to interpret that locus, that meanings. For example, Heidegger writes in his Building, Dwelling, and Thinking. Oh, it's 1954. I was wrong. It's not 19th century. It's 20th century. I'm sorry. Space is the essence that for which room has been made, that which is let into its bounds, that for which room is made is always granted and hence is jointed, that is gathered by virtue of a location. That is by such a thing as the bridge. Accordingly, space received their being from locations and not from space, not just from space. What Heidegger is there, sounds very complicated. What Heidegger is there trying to say is we can certainly define space as a geometrical construct, a physical construct. But when the space are put in a particular place, a location, we start to receive a lot more, developed into a lot more meanings and being than purely abstract space. That space carry meanings related to a culture, a place, the memory, the history, and everything. That is how us, human being, awareness of the environment, along with the shelter. Contemporary architect Fujimoto, who was there 2 years ago, did one of his experimental shelters using wood log, creating spaces over there, try to communicate about the ergonomy, the human body, and the various spaces created, and the relation of the spaces with the outside world, and how lights come in, and so on. These are examples of making space. And another different conditions of this space, that is a Chinese courtyard house again, which I wore just last weekend in west of Zhejiang, a mountainous areas county, looking at some villages. And that is just a simple, probably much more simpler than the Fujimoto's space, shelter that he created. You look at that simple shape, but you look closely, and there are particular way that a tile is put together that come from the development of particular technology and the way they interpret culture. And beyond that, in addition to the cloud and the sky that I was talking about, there's a little bit green over there. That is the bamboo trees, woods around the mountains. So every of this courtyard you look up, there is that bamboo, and that makes you aware of the locality that Heidegger was talking about, the locals, the locus, that it moves from the very simple notion of a physical bound into the being of a space, of dwellings. So the concept of dwelling, like this Chinese typical literary gentleman, a painting of Shi Tao, ideal diagrams of literary influenced by Zhuangzi and the Sanshui culture, mountain water culture, dwells in the mountains, surrounded with nature. Of course, it's very difficult. He's not going to have water. He's not going to have. It's a concept. It's ideas of being, of stay there, of being with the nature, and with his statue. And the reality of that concept developed into the estate of a house of probably a rich aristocrat or literati that built his house, his shelter, and bounded by his estate, his gardens, and then developed his nature within that and try to create a relationship between the dwelling, the shelter, and the nature, and his territory. Another non-painter, Ming Dynasty, Wen Zhongli, participate heavily in the design of garden, and also in one of his numerous paintings depict the daily life in the ideal shelter or ideal dwelling of a literary Chinese, with the trying to being like the earlier one Shi Tao was drawing for him, and the real nature that he tried to create his own nature in his garden. In this case, a lot more of the actual daily life of him and his friends and his attendants cooking the tea for them at that particular afternoon with the particular season, ambience, and conversation. So the daily life become an integral part of the pure space. So again, very last Chinese example, hopefully. I just happened to be there last weekend, and so I have handy experience of in that village. Typical gentry's house with a courtyard that the light coming through that, and the particular ways technology was developed for water drainage, for paneling system. Mostly outside the houses are white solid wall, but inside the houses are the most expensive material, which is timbers, panels, and sculpture. And also the desire of having nature turn the planters, that on two sides of the courtyard. So you could walk into that, and you step on these pebbles, and you get into the main hall. On the right-hand side and left-hand side, you were there developed two pieces of tree, and you look very closely of the pebbles, and that is a motif of a certain, I think this is a rhino. And there's something associated with this which I can't tell you, but it's also about symbolism of such. So it's material beauty, but it's also bring together meanings. And you look up, just like the last diagrams I have, it has that bamboos around you. So you have a locus is in the locality. Your relationship with nature and the specificity of that nature in these particular villages in Songyang County, near Lijiang was there. So houses, now, okay, no more Chinese courtyard houses. Now we look at other houses. Because this is the first time I give this lecture, so in the last few days I was totally panicked because I don't have time to collect images that I want. So I can only grab whatever in my computer and try to put together and communicate with you. So this is an architect, Luis Barragan, in Mexico, 20th century, that he built his many of houses. This his own house. That in one of the rooms in this house, he looked out from a dining table of his garden, of a nature. And that particular definition of the space, what Heidegger was talking about, the bound, also has a context, a locus, a relationship over here that certain sun coming into in the winter time and the summertime differently. And that is the daily life, probably Mr. Barragan having with his family members for breakfast, for lunch, for discussion, for reading. It turned into a space full of meanings. Or for his design for another rich clients, that this relationship of the patio developed into a much larger sort of water pool and bring in, again, different essence of locus in that. Architects of various different places construct the idea of a shelter, the idea of dwelling with various design techniques of a space which was a historical castle renovated by Carlos Capra, bring in light into that, the movement of the light, and the refinishing of the floor with the cement finishing, turn the space with a particular ambience, and with the exhibition is turning into a museum that with the artwork over there that create a very particular being over there. While another example of that, the architect deliberately to use architecture, historical architecture elements, remains, the leftover door motifs, and turn that into a pond, a water pond, and then this is in Venice, I believe University of Venice entrance, that you enter that and but in this space, in this particular place, the architect deliberately to make aware of the history, of the memory, of that collective memory of that particular city and place. Carlos Capra also did numerous projects over there, and they all use with particular technique of sensitivity with material and contemporary material in this case, and in the last case, traditional elements for concrete, for ceramic tiles, and for the way to make this planting that create a particular sense of place, of being, that he or whoever his clients using the space will remember that. Architects Liu Jiakun in Chengdu making his museum, Jianshan Boguguan, to house the artifacts during the Cultural Revolution, where he grew up as a high school student, gone through, went to the countryside, Xiaxiang, right? At the age of 20-something, returning to the city, taking examination, 高考, and try to get into university. And this is a collective memory for many, many, many youngsters in the generation of that time. Yeah? So the museum was there to house the artifacts during Cultural Revolution, including Mao's and so on. The Mao statue has a very, very complicated meaning over there. And the space deliberately to use red brick, because red brick in that context, like communes and so on, is typically used materials in the rural China that to make indoor spaces and outdoor spaces. What he claimed from of this building, not so much important to me as a museum, but is a space to house the what they call red memory. Okay. Red is brick, but red is also cultural revolution, also ideological and all of that. Yeah? So 红色记忆, that's what Liu Jiakun always talked about, and that exhibit in many of his work. And that goes beyond the power of purely a physical bound or space bound, but it goes into the essence of meanings. Gunnar Asplund's Tuesday night, we talked about Labyrinth, cigar reference. And then Yang He talking about another architect who did a competition with him. And then halfway, the clients told the architects, Gunnar Asplund, say, if you cut off, well, there are two ways you can go. One is we fire you, no more, bye-bye. Okay? The other way is you separate with your partner, and I'll go on the project with you. So Gunnar Asplund decided to go on the project. So that put Labyrinth in a miserable condition for many, many years. But Gunnar Asplund's wonderful architects, again, another one of my favorite architects, they work together on the projects of Woodland Chapel. It's not only an architecture project over here, it is a project, it's a cemetery, it's a big, big cemetery, among which many, many small buildings, including like this one, a chapel, which looks exactly like a primitive hut. And I believe this has a lot to do with their association of Nordic experiences of what they call national romanticism of Swedish. At the time, the forest the woods to build a shelter in the woods. In this case, it's actually a chapel. So a very, very big porch that inside that, the chapel, you go out, you come out, and these porticos, these columns, bring you from your chapel together with the vertical trees, and that become all in one as a continuous experience of sacred and of nature. And the Woodland Chapel, one of the very known passage of going into the final places for cremation, that the architects and the landscape architects made this mount with trees on top and a cross right along the passage, the roads. So you go through that with a wall on your left and a mount on your right, and you bypass the cross and you reach the final destination of the cremation chapel. And there's a photograph, four photographs I remember when I was students that I was sort of haunted by, which is summer, winter, autumn, and fall. Like for the season change, yeah, the landscape is so profound that the landscape itself now the idea of dwelling, the idea of shelter is not only the bound of a defined geometry of space, but it's really become the landscape. So the landscape itself brings us into, through times, into the final piece of chapels in this cremation. I'm not going to go through that. But here, what we're again is saying is the development of architecture, of shelter, of a concept of dwelling, of being, from secular worlds to the sacred world, and also to structure like that, which is cemetery, try to bring our being from a daily routine secular into the eternity in this architect's particular architect's explanation. And this is basically what I try to communicate with you. I have too many slides that I have prepared. I can do one more lecture. I should have just gone to sleep last night, about 1 o'clock. I spent another few hours putting together. Now, I like to talk about with a few examples of projects or work, and we hope every teacher will be able to do that. In this case, it's definitely a shelter. It's an architect that we all love, Alvar Aalto, Scandinavian architects, Finnish architects. He influenced very much by the last architects, Gunnar Asplund, is a Swedish architect, and Labyrinth and so on. Among many of his known works and a long career, one of which I like very much is his summer house that he built for himself. He himself is the client. Yeah. The house sits in a place that is an L-shaped patio or courtyard, and with a wall on one side looking at woods. Normally we arrive from the back, and then we enter past that, and we arrive through the woods, and it's actually the back of the patio, and you get into the patio that the architect's almost there having fun by himself, pretty much like a labyrinth, what they're doing, if you were there in 2 days ago's lectures, trying different ways of brick materials and laying it and different coursing, and try ceramic tiles, and tried it on the floor, and tried it on the wall. The particular textures that the architects and the particular craft that he engaged, make the being or the locus particularly profound. The window that communicate between the indoor and outdoor is the main transition. In the Scandinavian climate, you probably don't need that porch, but it's pretty clear in the winter and the summer. But what is inside? He also there trying his technologically experimenting innovative truss to hold the triangular roof. So in that, basically, if you look at the plan, if you look at the plan, you have toilet, you have living, but it's primarily spaces like that related to the patio over there. I assume they spend plenty times over there. And the main circulation, not much, but very simple. Always walk along the periphery of the L-shaped space because it's their relationship with the patio. And the shall we say living room, or the only rooms, which is pretty much everything, living, dining, it's a summer house with a loft above, and then with his own designed chairs and window sills and a cup of coffee or tea, looking at the patio that he experiment his bricks, make the being of the space, yeah, from purely a shelter into a concept of dwelling. Another architect, a great admirer of Alvar Aalto, practice on the opposite side of the globe. Glenn Murcutt, Australian architects, also Pritzker Prize winner, 10 years ago, built a shelter, also a summer house for himself. In this case, it's a garage converted. The garage that he decided to reuse it, and with the lift up of the panel, the porch, created that porch and extended the wood timber outwards to create a very desirable shaded but also sunny transitional spaces between the habitation, dwelling, and natural plan, Australia landscape, flat landscape. So the architects add a little bit necessity of utilitarian use, toilet, and so on next to that, with remaining the original, I forgot it's a garage, I'm not so sure, it's a garage or it's a farmhouse, that over there, retaining all the structures with very spontaneous use of material that he is familiar with, industrial material available from the water drainage down pipe to development of innovative window sills around the house. And the main spaces are the places that you cook, you have meals, you writing, readings, and now it's the places that he hosts his guests. He promised me when I go there, he will put me in this places that he has made most of his friends there. And that's what the house look at. It's like a shelter, yes, but it has certain quality of beauty about material innovation, tactile quality of the building, or we say tectonic quality of the building that exhibit. Even in that little house, there's a clarity of structure that is old and the new replaced using the same principle, and the new reinforced one with a new material, and a very large window that is created to look at the other side of the view, and the two windows are made in a way you can open it up horizontally to also provide you, in case of rain, but very nice ventilation and communication between indoor and outdoor. And the wood panel plumb was put it in a way, it's the old, but it's also the new, following the same articulation or fabric of the material. He's another admirer, the architects, Glenn Murcutt, learned from, was a very, very opposite architect, Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe, 1950s, built his Fransworth house, was a stunning architecture statement. Yeah? It's a new concept of dwelling, which relates to the Philip Johnson's glass house that I've shown you earlier. Yeah? But this is far more important in the development of the concept of architecture and the idea of perception, how we perceive architecture. It is a house, of course it is a shelter. It is a shelter for his clients to live there, but it is also the idea of his clients through very minimum articulation or partition or arrangement of judgment. Sorry, it's the next slide. But I don't have a plan here, but the relationship of wall panels, of privacy, of public, of private space that in related to nature was there totally haunted Glenn Murcutt, the young Australian architect. I think I heard he read the magazines in his father's a builder. Read the architecture magazine from the United States about this house, and then he decided to go for architecture. And for the rest of his career, that he built numerous houses, but he very much influenced by the Mies van der Rohe, the very grid, logical, modular, structural system, in such. And the long house of a typology that in his early career, he built several houses like that in Sydney, very much Mies van der Rohe's language, very, very finely built. The houses lift up from the ground like Mies van der Rohe's house, and this is actually a conversion of an old house. And the wood deck is added beyond that, very much like Francois, Mies van der Rohe's house, and then stepping down into the living room and turn original sort of Victorian bungalow into a modern Mies van der Rohe's house. And when he get his first commission of a house, a Marine Shore house, when he started his office, not in Sydney, 3 hours away. Don't remember the name of the city. That for his first complete new house projects, he was there trying to find way to build that. Several things come to my mind. Of course, I believe the rectangular house of a design method, vocabulary, language, type, prototype was somewhere there. And the clarity of Mies van der Rohe's column, grid, and the flexible use of space and the flow space was there. But Glenn Murcutt started to think about how am I going to build it, or how the contractor is going to build it. He lived in Sydney. If he then 3 hours drive to the project site. There's no way that he can drive every day to look at the construction. So he told himself, I have to find a way that the local contractor and carpenter know how to do it. And so with my drawings and with their understanding of how to put materials, structure, assemblage together, they can build a house of what I want. The house definitely is clear that the house is a long house because the house are able to then facing the vast landscape around that. It's very different from the context of a Beijing, a Chinese house in the city that you enclose it and create your internal patio. This is a house that is sitting in the middle of the natural landscape. He found shelter or shed for sheep, okay, to make producing wool over there. That everybody know how to build it. Every contractor know how to build it with the materials of timber and steel roofing, corrugated roofing, and so on. Then he started to develop a language for the house that he thinks the technology should be convenient, but also aesthetically innovative in a way to bring together idea of his house. He designed the house a little bit like Francois, the Mies van der Rohe's house, a rectangular one, and it's two actually. So one is for the universal large space with utilities on the one side, but you can flow around it. And the other one is the bedroom, 2 bedroom that is put in there, and they are jointed by a transition or circulation. And structurally, it is very clear you need a column, 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 column to make this roof shelter. And you did another set of column to make another one. So you have two rectangular shelter, right one bus to the other, created a domestic living condition of patio, covered patio, private bedrooms, and public living rooms, all looking out at the landscape around them. The house adopted the principle, and it was the idea at the beginning that want to use the very simple construction method of a shelter that would be able to adopt the change of the future. Therefore, it was true, and he was very happy about it, that a few years later the client says, I want a few more bedrooms. So the same house was made addition. So this part was made an extent over with another bedroom over here, and this house, how does this work? Yes, so this house was here extended for another living room, and then with a patio deck in the front and the back. And almost a similar relationship of household was extended, so the house transformed. The interiors of the house is very simple, basic, but very clear structural principles, and a set of shading devices was developed to deal with the environment of shadings and views and so on. And the houses take totally the shape and the construction logic of the wool shed. That is very, very of the idea of a shelter into architecture, a very strong architecture ideas. And he developed his career, the rest of his career of his house. This is the house we were talking about, this is a section, and that's a plan into this called Nicholas house, another house that also has this twin relationship, or another one like this Magni house, which the two part, there's always two roof and long house, and into another one after using the same syntax. And the Magni house, this is many, many years later that he built with this time light well steel construction, that the house has two parts. One is the utility part, and then the other is a free open space, and the water drainage coming through this become the feature of the house, that Glenmark can always collect recycle used water, that developed into a much more sophisticated architecture language, and the same type of speciality between indoor and outdoor, covered outdoor patio spaces, with the technology, the vernacular, innovative, new architecture language, developed the same idea from the woodshed now, which is mostly timber, and now into still corrugated metal, but his own language, his own architecture language. And with that, he won the Pritzker Prize. And answer to one of the questions, one of the historian, I forgot, Nicholas, has a famous line in his history book, textbook, say, bicycle shed is not an architecture, but Lincoln Cathedral is an architecture. So we can use that to conclude what we're trying to say is the architects of late 19th century, a British historian, very important one, as an announcement, manifesto at the beginning of his book about architecture. This architecture is the high style of art, like a cathedral, Lincoln Cathedral. Bicycle shed is just for a utility, it's not an architecture. Glenmark proved with his shed as an architecture like the wool shed, transform that into an architecture that bring him into the new horizon or paradigm or of capital A architecture with the best prestigious award that he won. And that is what answer the discussion today of the relationship of shelter and and architecture. This just happened yesterday. It's my new buildings in Hong Kong. It's a shelter, certainly. It's a contender that in Kwun Tong, Gai Park, that the government want to have display exhibition places for the industrial heritage of Guangdong. So we study, actually it was started from a study project we did for the government, and at the end the government want to propose exhibition spaces over there, and we reuse 4 containers. Containers certainly for utilitarian use, but containers also used by farmers in new territory to store things. And containers also used by contractors for temporary shelter, for office, for dormitory, for all that. And therefore, we turn that container into exhibition spaces for not only recycle, reuse, that's not so of a big deal, but really for a park that need an exhibition, we propose, rather than have a museum ideas of exhibition, what we really want is a pavilion, an open pavilion, like a community spaces that everybody can come, and then entering into that, they can use it as a recreation space for having their lunch. I don't know if they allow them to play mahjong, but I plan to play a table over there. That, on the one hand, propaganda of what government want to say, talk about concerning for heritage, industrial heritage. On the other hand, it's a popular community space. That the idea of opening up every part of that has a conceptual reason that the pavilion wanted to be opened. Every piece using different way of opening, sliding, folding, rotating, opening, but the reason also being to ensure the pavilion that from every angle you can look into it, so you don't want this to be a love hotel at night. So it's all opened. In the typhoon season, the hotel can be, the shelter can be closed, sealed for protection, and reopen up again after the typhoon season. So that is, I'll end that with, for this lecture, as an idea of a shelter, definitely, and the shelter is also an architecture. I think that is fine. The rest of them actually probably people will cover that in the end. Okay, thank you very much.